what are some things you think of when you imagine like a typical American street? Just like you can shout them out, popcorn them.
Gray, busy.
Okay. People in the back. Cars. Yeah. You can probably imagine something like this, right? Congested, loud, maybe a bit dirty, pedestrians weave in and out of cars, bicyclists are competing with traffic. But what if there was an alternative? What if there was something like this, where you have widened sidewalks giving pedestrians enough space, cars are protected from traffic by a row of trees. Rather than cars, we're actually using public buses that conveniently carry you around the city. This is what a car-free city could look like. Now, before we move forward, let's establish one thing. Car-free cities are not trying to get rid of motorized vehicles entirely. They're trying to refocus our movements more locally to transform cities into more attractive, healthy places to live, which should sound pretty good. Well, you've probably experienced something like that during COVID. Does this look familiar to anyone? What is it? Where is it? Yeah, it's Palo Alto. So the closure of streets to outdoor dining and walking is a perfect example of car-free design right in our backyard. But interestingly, not everyone loves this, which brings me to what we'll talk about today. We're going to look at resident opposition to car-free cities to understand how we can move towards implementation. So you might be skeptical, why even entertain the idea of car-free cities? Well, there's actually a significant amount of data showing that decreased car transportation will improve things like social well-being, physical health, and environmental factors. It makes sense. If we're introducing more green space, more active transportation, we are overall going to feel better, and our cities will also look better. But if that's the case, if we have the data to back up car-free design, if there are actual examples, there are European cities that are building car-free design, why are we only seeing it implemented during COVID in America? Why did it take a pandemic for us to think about better using our urban space? To understand this, we're going to look at three things. One, how did our roads become so car-centric in the first place? Two, there are a lot of stakeholder groups that oppose car-free urbanism, but we're going to hone in on resident opinions. And then after establishing assumptions and behaviors that residents have around car-free urbanism, we're going to look at how actually engaging them in the planning process can help us move towards a car-free future. So starting with this first bit, how did we become so car-centric in the first place? Well, in the 20th century, cars became more readily available, and therefore there was more congestion. And the way cities addressed this was hiring traffic engineers. And in their engineering mindset, they treated roads and streets like public utilities that needed to be regulated. They treated them like water pipes or power lines that needed to be regulated for efficiency. And so they took what is called a structural urbanist approach. They created permanent and lasting change, like multi-lane boulevards and traffic lights that keep cars moving at a fixed rate, which we see today. Interestingly, a lot of car-free design is actually implemented under tactical urbanism, which is low budget, like easy to implement changes like painted sidewalks and parklets. And that's actually a problem. So Barcelona is one of the many European cities exploring car-free design. They're in the midst of building 500 super blocks, which are basically standalone neighborhoods that can be walked and biked. And when they first piloted the project, they mostly made tactical decisions. They painted weird circles on the ground and created makeshift playgrounds, and residents had no idea how to interact with it. They were like, this is entirely superficial, what have you done to our community space? It was only until Barcelona started creating structural changes, thinking, how can we actually implement these super blocks into a greater network, that people started to like the change. And what can we learn from that? Well, a lot of that same resistance to tactical urbanism is mirrored in the way that Americans are receiving car-free urbanism. To zero in on this a little bit more, we're going to look at a case study in San Francisco. So during the pandemic, San Francisco implemented something called slow streets. These are streets that are closed to car traffic, giving people more safe outdoor space to exercise. As things have started to reopen, the city has opened conversation about making them permanent. And that has received a lot of resident backlash, which is actually visible by how many of the signs have just been pancaked by cars or entirely moved out of the road. Scholars who study opposition to green transportation often see that residents ground their arguments in one of two things, this cultural component or economic component. Mm-hmm. To look at how these are manifesting in San Francisco, I looked at a Nextdoor thread. Nextdoor is a social networking platform that lets residents of a similar city or neighborhood connect. This woman basically posted this thread saying, the pandemic is winding down, we need to reopen our streets for cars, pedestrians belong on the sidewalk. A lot of people responded, kind of upvoting her perspective that slow streets create a lot of inequities. that, this woman points out, I can't bike 10 plus miles to work, and also I can't default to public transportation because the city's bus system is not adequate. I don't have enough surface in my neighborhood. There are also people who made the cultural argument that slow streets are shifting the demographics of the city. This man kind of ironically / cynically points out that they're built for a world of entitled 25 to 35-year-olds, which his underlying argument reveals a sort of cultural cynicism about green transportation. Cars are deeply rooted in the American ideals of independence, mobility, and status. It's a middle-class ideal to buy a family car, whereas bicycles and other forms of micro-transportation are much more linked with the creative class. There's a fear that opening our cities to car-free design, to greater expanded bike lanes, will further the gentrification and movement of millennials and Gen Zers that are already starting to take hold in San Francisco and other American cities. Moving a little bit beyond the cultural component, there's also some economic opposition. This user points out that the SFMTA, the Transportation Society, needs almost 50% of their funding from car owners, which comes from gas taxes and parking permits. This is actually an accurate statistic. And it points to the belief that if roads are public utilities, then the people who are paying for them should be able to use them, which makes sense under our current model. But the thing that it overlooks is if we were to overhaul our cities and create car-free cities, funding streams would also change. People who are biking, walking, scootering would also need to pay their share. Our funding would be overhauled as well. So I think the thing to kind of zoom out and think about is this thread garnered almost 400 comments. People reacted with a strong sense of emotion, and it makes sense. When you start to see change in the built environment around you in your home, you react with emotion. This raises the question that slow streets are an example of tactical urbanism. I am a San Francisco resident. I support slow streets, but I'm not blind to their flaws. They do create inefficiencies on adjacent streets. They are not supported by public transportation, and the concerns over demographic shifts are very real. Gentrification is very real in the city. Which raises the question, is tactical urbanism, especially like slow streets, actually helping us move towards a car-free future, or is it detrimental because they are inefficiently integrated and therefore actually enhances resistance to things like that? The Better Block project is trying to address this by creating structural change immediately. So Jason Roberts, the founder of the Better Block Foundation, wanted to create bike lanes in his home city of Dallas. He went to City Hall with his proposal. He was only met with resistance. He knew it wasn't going to happen. So basically, he gathered a group of neighbors, and for one weekend, they broke as many laws as they could. They hand-painted bike lanes onto blocks. They created outdoor seating, cafe seating. And then at the end of the weekend, they invited legislators out to enjoy the space. And kind of semi-expecting to be arrested, everyone actually really enjoyed the space. And laws started to change. Legislators saw how much more active and alive the space was, how people were actually interacting with the built environment. And so from that first success, the Better Block has gone on to pilot similar projects across the world. They follow what they call a 90-day recipe. It's a simple 5-step process. They begin by meeting with the community and thinking about what space could we reimagine. Then they work collaboratively with stakeholders to design that space. How could we reimagine this so it's more inviting? Then they get a round of feedback. Then they actually build it. The community actually engaged in the building process. And then the Better Block hands it back to the community with a report and timeline for next steps. Part of why this has been so successful is that it inverts the traditional planning process. Usually planners are making decisions for many without thinking about the human-centered design element of urban design. The Better Block inverts this by engaging the community with planners, legislators, small business owners, thinking, what do we want to see in our city? How can we make this more livable? J.H. Crawford is sort of this radical car-free design advocate, and he speaks to this directly when he says, values affect virtually every human activity, certainly including city design. The question then becomes, which values, whose values, and how should they be expressed? Part of why the Better Block has been so beneficial is it shows us that if we fail to engage resident perspectives in the planning process, we're going to repeat what happened in the 20th century. We cannot apply an engineering framework to issues of urbanism that have deep social and community underpinnings. Simply put, in order to overhaul the structural urbanism we have right now that favors cars, we are going to need structural change that favors people. and that includes redesigning the public planning process to include resident voices.